The project comes out of work that I did for my dissertation. I began with an interest in a genre of poetry called ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is poems to, for, and about visual arts. It has a very long tradition. In fact, it's been traced as being sort of continuous since Homer's first description of Achilles' shield in the Iliad. So we have a very long-standing tradition, which means that we have lots and lots of texts to work with. Unfortunately, we don't seem to use all of them or talk about all of them, and so that's where my work started. What I'd like to do is I'm going to give you like a brief breakdown of everything that I'm going to talk about so that you can know where we're going, and then I'll go back and go into more specifics. So what I want to do is start sort of from a good practice, from a good practice standpoint, and privilege the humanities questions that are going on here, why I actually sort of went to start using these methods. I didn't just go out in search of a digital tool and then want to bang on something with it. I actually had a question that I needed help answering. Then I want to talk about the opportunities afforded by new technologies that can help me ask these sort of long-standing humanities questions in new ways. About the challenges that are presented as soon as you start using technology to address humanities questions. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the discoveries that I've made heretofore. This is still work in progress, but at the same time, there's some really interesting and relevant findings that I can share with you. And then just to give you some ideas about where someone who's doing work like what I do might want to do with it next, or what kinds of things are opening up that might bring opportunities to other scholars where this might kind of work, but not really, and maybe want to do something slightly different. So, the humanities question. Ekphrasis for about the last 20 years has been framed by an article written by W.J.T. Mitchell called Ekphrasis and the Other, in which he frames the ekphrastic tradition from all of it, from Homer forward, using 5 poems, all by white men. 3 of them are romanticists. That model of ekphrasis becomes the dominant way in which we understand the genre since about 1992 until the present. There are some problems to me with creating a model based on so few examples. Here's a quote from Mitchell, where he describes at the end why he thinks that his description of ekphrasis is canonical. What he describes is that in the ekphrastic poem, you have a speaker gazing upon a still and silent image, and then transmitting that picture to a reader who may or may not, usually does not, have access to that image. Mitchell goes back and restages that dynamic, that triangle, by explaining the historical, socio-economic, political, gender tensions that surface when we start talking about images with words. And he describes it by saying that these poems are canonical in the way they stage ekphrasis because they speak to its semiotic structure. That the image is identified as feminine, the text is identified as masculine, and that those 2 things are going to be in contest. And he also goes on to say that, sure, I don't talk about any examples by women, but that wouldn't change anything anyway. I disagree. But when I read those descriptions of ekphrasis, I felt uneasy because I felt that if you were a woman writing about a visual image, that it couldn't necessarily, unless you were somewhat masochistic, always be about a male-dominant gaze, that women authors couldn't always be writing from a standpoint of being a ventriloquist for a male speaker. And yet, in the next major study of ekphrasis that goes from, Museum of Words goes and tracks the entire history of ekphrasis from Homer through Ashbery, is where he ends. He says that ekphrasis is a literary mode that turns on the antagonism, the commonly gendered antagonism between verbal and visual media. So it becomes a necessary part of how we understand the genre from a critical perspective. What Mitchell creates by establishing this ekphrastic situation is a kind of model. It's a model in which the speaker is frequently considered to be male, active, because he has a voice with which he can control the reader's understanding of something that is not available to them, that it has a sense of authority, and that this is the entity that negotiates a relationship between the image and the reader. Then there's the image. The image is usually a work of art, although some ekphrases, especially in the 20th century, don't have to be about visual art necessarily, but about visual culture. It needs to be about some sort of constructed or physical object. It can also be about a notional or imagined one. If you think about Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, that's a notional ekphrasis. There's no actual urn that he's describing. It's one pieced together through his exposure to similar artwork at the British Museum. So the image is framed as silent and still. It is the object of the speaker's desire. They want to be like the image. They want to subsume the image. And then at the same time, its silence, its stillness is imposing and causes fear in the writer, because it literally, usually in many of these poems that have been cited as the canon of ekphrasis, steals the breath of the speaker. So it has a kind of frightening element and dangerous element to it. And then there's the reader. Mitchell says that the reader is understood to be male, a kind of complicit partner in the reconstruction of the image through language, that it's complicit in this looking, fixating, and desiring the physical subject. And in the 20th century, the dynamic changes significantly as art becomes more available to the public. So you think about the emergence of public art museums at the beginning of the 20th century. And then, of course, as you march your way forward towards the end, we have the vast reproduction and distribution of words and images through things like the internet. And it's interesting that Mitchell's discussion of ekphrasis happens and is published in 1994. Another major event happens in 1994, which is the first Mozilla browser becomes distributed. And in picture theory, Mitchell says that the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the image, because there is so much of it already. And at that point, Mitchell could never have even imagined what kind of explosion would happen in the next even 5 to 10 years. Sorry, I just clicked forward. But Mitchell creates a model, and this is what we do. When we're literary theorists, literary studies, we construct models. We think about how something might operate. Willard McCarty explains about models that you can have two different kinds. You can have a model of something and a model for something. A model for something is when you create like a model car, and then you go out and you build a real car based on your miniature model that is small, comprehensible, and where you can minutely create all of the details of that model and get it just right, so that when you go to build the larger one, you know that you've worked through all of the complexities at a smaller scale. Another way of thinking about models is when you take a smaller set of data and you can imagine the similarities, the convergences between different kinds of examples of something, and project. So you are creating a model for what might be too big for any human being to consciously understand, or to be able to hold all at one time in their mind.
An example of this is thinking about things like romanticism. We have models of how romanticism works in literature. Because we can't read all romantic writing or Victorian writing. I know Natalie was just here, so I can harp on the Victorianists a little bit. So this is what Mitchell does. He takes a few examples and he creates a model for it. And we call it the ekphrastic triangle. My problem is, though, that I don't feel like it's an adequate sampling to use in order to create an adequate model. And one of the reasons for that is that women are everywhere in ekphrasis because they are always, the image is always gendered as feminine, and yet they're nowhere because no major theorizations of the genre include more than one poem by a woman. And yet women have been looking at, enjoying, talking about, writing about images all the way along. We have examples of it from the 17th century when we talk about women writing about household objects. We have, to a scrap of linen, for example, would be considered an ekphrastic poem. You have Christina Rossetti, you have H.D., you have Marianne Moore. You have some of the most popular poems by women poets that we recognize in the 20th century are ekphrastic. So why would so many women participate in this kind of genre if it's such a hostile environment in which to operate? It means that we have to be getting something wrong about what the possibilities are for ekphrasis. And so what I wanted to do is see what happens when we get away from Mitchell's model, which is very difficult to do because it is so easy. It can be mapped on just about anything because it's so basic. How do we break that bind and try to reconceive of the genre in a way that includes examples of ekphrastic poems by women as a central part of that tradition? How do we do that? And also, how do we use more examples of poems? If this is true for women, then there have to also be examples by male poets that we're just not adequately considering. So, the opportunity that is presented by distant reading is that we can, I know that Natalie talked about this, look at thousands of texts at once and try to identify patterns among them. So when Franco Moretti talks about reading at a distance, he talks about the fact that there are limitations. There are limitations to close reading because you can only do so much at a time, and distant reading changes that dynamic. We are using computational methods able to do different kinds of readings. So computers don't necessarily read in the sense that we humans read. Computers compute. They can count faster. They can hold all the documents and compare them faster. We can't hold 2,000 poems in our hand or in our brains at the same time and see patterns across them. But we can train a computer to do some of those things. So with a little bit of skepticism, I sort of jumped into this and said, okay, what kinds of questions can we ask using these kinds of methods? And the key to me is not that we just take this tool and we sort of apply it randomly to everything, but I wanted to think about how does topic modeling, which is the tool that I chose, work? And does it work in a way that's going to ask the kinds of questions that I think are going to be relevant to the research that I'm doing? So I settled on a method called topic modeling, which is an algorithm called latent Dirichlet allocation, LDA. And the reason for that is because topic modeling is a probabilistic model. That means that it uses chance, and it uses repetition, and it uses organization over things like syntax. And if you've ever tried to run a syntactic analyzing a natural language parsing program which looks at syntax, on something like Stein, it just doesn't work. So I couldn't use a syntactic tool. I had to use something that looked at language differently. For me, what topic modeling does is it looks at poems in a way in which you see it as a kind of bag of words, and then try to see if we can recognize any patterns. And the reason that that's a salient path of entry is that ekphrasis has a number of conventions that we just assume to be true. We assume that the poem will talk about stillness. We assume that it will use a language in which words of ravishment, desire, courtly love are heavily present. We assume that, that there will also be conversations about silence, breathlessness. So I knew that there were terms, there were words that are supposedly very frequent in this kind of poetry, and so I should see them showing up. So, what is topic modeling? Does anyone already know how topic modeling works?
We've had a workshop in September about it, but
You did?
not everybody here was there, so go for it.
I've come up with my simple analogy for topic modeling. This is a metaphor. It's not precise, but I think it's effective in that it gives you a really good sense of how computers go about solving problems and what we can do to leverage that for humanistic inquiry. So, imagine that you are too lazy to go and find out what is available at the local farmer's market. You don't want to go all the way to drive to wherever it is, but you'd like to see if whether or not what's there would be of interest to you. So, what are some ways that you could figure that out without ever having to go to the farmer's market? One way is that you could figure out how many of your neighbors go to that farmer's market. Each neighbor would bring with them a basket, and we're going to assume that the neighbor is equal to an author, and that the basket is equal to some writing that they do, a document. Now, that neighbor is going to go to the farmer's market, and at the farmer's market there's going to be all of these bins that has all kinds of produce. And that person is going to go and pick out pieces of produce, put it in their basket. So, if each of those different bins with different kinds of produce are topics, this is how topic modeling imagines that authors work. They go to something, they select words or fruit or vegetables from vegetable bins, the apples bin, the bananas bin, whatever bin, cabbage bin. And then they put it in their document or their basket. And it becomes something new. So that basket then is a representation of what the neighbor wanted to put together for some purpose. It's a combination of different things, and it can be broken down into groups. Okay? So when they come home with this basket, you're going to go through it. And you're going to think about, okay, so they have a pear, and they have an apple, and they have something else, and you would start to sort. Okay? So the next step in that process is a sorting. But you wouldn't just do it with one basket, you would do it with every single basket that came home from the farmer's market. After you took an account of how many baskets there were, how many different kinds of produce there were in each basket, you would be able to have some probabilistic sense, some general sense of how much of each kind of produce you could expect to find at the farmer's market. That's topic modeling. So the topics then are a distribution over a fixed vocabulary. That means at the farmer's market there were a certain number of items. They were broken down into a certain number of types, and each basket represents some sample across the whole. That's what a topic is. It's some sample across a pattern of a larger collection. The other thing you can do once you've done that, even if you don't have a precise, but you're pretty close, you don't have a precise, you can make some pretty good guesses about a few questions. You could say how much of each kind of produce was available at the farmer's market. You could say how much of each kind of fruit you would predict to be in each basket. So for example, if the Smiths go and they get 10 apples and 4 pears and 16 bananas, did I already say bananas? And you have another neighbor who has 10 pears, 5 apples. How many bananas do you think they would have? You probably could make an educated guess. If you look at however many people usually have that amount, you could start to make guesses about what other things might be in their basket based on the number of kinds of produce you know that were at the market and that kind of thing. So you start making predictions. Topic modeling does this with words. And it does it because it not only takes the word, but it takes the word in context. So, for example, if I had an Asian pear, but I didn't know what an Asian pear was, I would probably look to see what other kinds of produce it shows up with the most. Then after making that kind of decision, I would make my best guess, and I might put it over in the apples section. But then I might keep picking out some more Asian pears and see that more frequently it shows up with other kinds of pears. So I might take that pear and put it back, the Asian pear, and put it with a different grouping. So based on where you're most likely to find that word, you can make some more nuanced determinations. For me, that's called polysemy in language, when a word can mean 2 different things. I'm not saying that the Asian pear means 2 different things. I just took something confusing. But for example, ham. Okay, ham can be a meat, but it can also ham something up. So it can have another kind of verb. So LDA can make some determinations based on where it sees the word ham in different documents and decide if ham means the verb sense or ham means the food sense. The advantage of that to me is that it didn't depend on syntax in order to make, it has no idea what the words mean. All it's doing is it's picking up the patterns and where they're most frequently found. And because poems are very hard to read in a sensible way, that seemed like an interesting way forward. And so what I'm showing you here is how topic modeling reads a poem. So the first step is it takes out all of the little words. All those words that actually Natalie was talking about last time as being very, very important to determining some stylistics. I've gotten rid of all of them. And I'm looking at poetry in a completely different way. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. That's a rather anxiety-producing process, particularly for someone who's a literary scholar who can hem and haw over the difference between and the in a line quite a lot. And that was a bit of a leap of faith, but I will show you that it actually turned out very well in the end. So the first thing you do is you strip out all those little words. The next thing is that it determines which word goes in which topic bin. So if you look at the layout here, I have 3 of the most frequently found topics in Anne Sexton's The Starry Night. So I have taken a corpus of 4,500 poems. I have modeled them so that each individual poem was a document. The model came up with 60 I put in how many topics. So I say, okay, let's be sure that we have 60 topics in this. Sometimes finding that sweet point is you play with it a little bit. You ask it for 40 topics, you have it for 60 topics. But I came up with 60 for this particular model, and that gave me some pretty good results. And what I found is, in this poem, these 3 topics were most likely to be found. And then I went into the document and I looked at the individual word assignments to topics, and I found out that each of the green words were assigned to topic 32, each of the yellow were assigned to topic, which one is that? 21, or 12, and the next is topic 54. The other interesting thing is that then you can start to see from these word distribution lists, other poems use the same words with other combinations of words. And that gives you some insight into, for example, if I start chasing an ekphrastic poem, I can look to see how many other ekphrastic poems draw from the same topics, for example. There are limitations to this, though. Some of it has to do with where and when and how you get the data to run the model. So you can obviously sort of figure out that what you put into it is also what you're going to get back out of it. So if I put in more poems by men than poems by women, it's going to give me more results of poems by men than it is going to give me poems by women. So you have to be aware of the data that you're using. There wasn't, when I started this, any sort of set of best practices for how you assemble, prepare, and do this kind of work with highly figurative language. And I'll explain why that is different in a minute, too. So I had to come up with that along the way. And we didn't know how it would handle poetic texts. The sample sizes are smaller per document, for example, and there's more ambiguity. So one of the ones that I like to play with, for example, is May Swenson's Lionhead poem, which is about, it is about a dandelion, but it is really about a phallus. So it never uses actual descriptive words of the thing that it's referring to. It refers to a dandelion. But you know, thick with sort of innuendo and subtext, what the poem is actually talking about. So that poem models with flowers. For example, if you were to look at other kinds of words where you see the word dandelion appear, or stem, or mane, or leaf, and yet you can still get something interesting out of it. But what we didn't know is what was it going to do with that kind of figurative language where there's a high degree of ambiguity. And it turns out that that thing that I was telling you about with the Asian pear, where it has this kind of a combination of polysemy, actually works very well at looking at that kind of problem. So, what questions can we ask, and how do we fine-tune the data in order to find answers to those questions? The thing is that the challenge of distance is that you can have a view that is too narrow, but you can also have a view that is too large. And so the real trick is figuring out at what distance you're going to be able to ask the kinds of questions that you want to ask. And that takes a little bit of playing around. So for me, in my own situation, one of the biggest challenges, because I was dealing primarily with poetry from the 20th century, had to do with assembling a data set. And the reason that that is a problem has a lot to do with copyright. Oddly enough, very few people let you have, huge amounts of text of currently under copyright poetry. So it turns out you have to steal it. And so what I had to do was develop a small macro that I could write into a browser program that would go into the Poetry Foundation poems.org, which is the the American Academy of Poets website, and a couple others, Poetry Daily, and it went in and scraped the data off of those websites and put it into a unified format, so that for every poem I would get a title, I would get the author, and I would get just the text of the poem, and it would each jump into a new document, and then I had a system for naming those documents. So there's another challenge to that, which is that it makes it very hard for me to actually publish a lot of of the models that I've run, because I could be sued. But it was still fun to do. The process, I ended up getting 4,771. About 200 of those were duplicates, so those end up getting thrown out. I used a macro to put them together. I created digital copies of the poems. Now, it's also important to recognize that I have stripped that out of any of its visual features. So that's another sort of limitation of distance, that I have quite consciously taken it out of any kind of, it's made it one basically long string of words. And so I got the title, the name of the poet, the text of the poem. The total distribution of my sample size was 4,266 poems from poets.org, which is the American Academy of Poetry. From poems.com, I got 373 poems. And then you can see I have much smaller sizes with these targeted groups. The Gazer's Spirit was a specifically ekphrastic anthology that I went and digitized myself. Same with Poets on Paintings, which is another, there are lots of different ekphrastic anthologies. So I increased the sample size of ekphrastic poems that way. The next challenge is preparing your data. So, kinds of things I had to think about. When you are preparing for topic modeling, like I mentioned before, you take out all of the little words. But little words are really, really important. I'm trying to remember for example, Robert Browning's My Last Duchess is a sample of ekphrastic poetry. And the line, she looked and her looks went everywhere. Every single word in that line would be removed using the topic modeling program that I was using, which is called Mallet. Mallet has a stop word list. That means the list of words, and I have a sample right here of the kinds of words that are function words that have very low semantic value. In other words, you don't put a lot of meaning into those words, but they're used very frequently in writing, and so their appearance in the text can throw off the answers, or the answers can throw off the topic model, because those are not the most important words, but because they're the most frequent, this particular algorithm would think of them as the most influential words in that text. So you have to take some of them out. The question is, how many? When, for example, her looks and her looks went everywhere is such a critical line in terms of ekphrasis. The idea of looking, the word look goes out completely. The idea of stillness, those kinds of words, we place so much value on those in this particular area. So one of the biggest challenges was for me to figure out how to prepare that data. What I ended up discovering, though, and I'll talk about it a little more in a second, was that even when those words were no longer in the text, it was as if there were ghosts of them there. When you read the constructions of the topics, and you could see the poems most frequently associated with particular topics, you could tell that the syntactical relationship that depended on words that were removed from the during the stop word list, that those relationships still existed in the results, which I found to be completely fascinating. The other challenge is metadata. There's 4,000 poems. We didn't have a whole lot of information about the data that we stripped off of those web pages, so I had to make very tactical decisions about how I wanted to mark up the text. One of the big advantages of using topic modeling is that you can use very, very dirty data. You don't have to have a whole lot of metadata to make some discoveries about text. That's why people love it. It's so popular because one of the biggest challenges in library studies is about how to adequately and uniformly create good metadata. It's time-consuming, it's complicated, but we don't need metadata in order to work with some of these texts. So that's what I ended up doing, though, was I created just a couple of fields. One was whether or not the poet was male or female or undetermined, and whether or not the poem was already considered ekphrastic or not. That made it easy for me to go in and do different kinds of models, sucking out different kinds of texts. The other interesting thing that I discovered along the way is that poetry.org, the Poetry Foundation website, is very heavily lopsided toward male authors. And we tried to think a lot about why that is still. Partially that could be because they draw heavily from before the 20th century. And yet I went back, and I'm still in the process of doing some date metadata. There still seem to be, from the 20th century, more examples of poems by men than there are by women. That challenged, I sort of assumed that there would be a lot of effort put toward some sort of balancing in that collection. And that challenged my own sort of ability to use the data set with any kind of authority about what I could say about what women think, because there were much fewer examples. So here it's 681 female poets and 1,021 male poets, so a difference of almost half. I'm sorry, that was in the other data set. The American Academy of Poets is 1,360 women, poems by women, and 2,570 poems by men. So so one is the poets and one is the number of poems by either gender. And I still had a relatively small sample size of ekphrastic poems, the ones that I could for certain determine without having to read every single one of them, was about 276. And yet, it still turns out that you can do a lot with 276 poems. So we could continue. Discoveries. So one of the things that I found out was that, for example, when you ran topic models, the problem when you left in those small syntactic words that we think carry so much weight in poetry was that I got the same kinds of topics, but in much clearer focus when the stop words weren't there. So in fact, even though I felt like ekphrastic poetry would very heavily depend on words like looks and still and breathless and a few others, see, it turns out that the same topics showed up when I left those words in and when I took them out. The only difference was that I could actually get topics that were more heavily ekphrastic when those words weren't there. So when I modeled the entire data set of poems, and so 4,500 poems, and that included ekphrastic and non-ekphrastic. In the one in which I left these particular words in, still, like, look, see, in, the ekphrastic poems were more diverse among the topics. They were more evenly, they were spread out a little more. When I took those words out, I had topics that were not the most dominant topics. So for example, I'd have models where you would get at least 60% of the poems in the collection draw from this. And it's usually a topic that's like God, light, bright, something like that. That wasn't necessarily the topic where I found the most ekphrastic poems. So that's how I knew I was going in the right direction. I knew that it was more, it was able to predict that about 1/4 of the poems had elements of ekphrasis in them. And I did that by combing through long, long lists of poems that were affiliated with each topic, because there was no other good way to do that. The other discovery that I made is that I could start making some statements about how topic modeling treats poetry. There are some topics that show up that are clearly just bad data topics, OCR errors or other typos that tend to happen very frequently. Those all clustered in the same. Also dialect poems, so when you get something that's clearly speaking on a kind of affected dialect, they all went into one or two specific topics. You get large chunk topics, so I have the oingy boingy woe, which is this one poem that keeps showing up. It's really, really long, and I forget who it's by, but it uses like yang. It has crazy words in it, and every time it shows up as one topic, and I know to throw that out because it's just one poem. It's pulling everything in one direction. The two others are not considered by information scientists to be relevant to topic modeling in the sense that they use it when they use topic modeling to understand large corpora of non-fiction texts, scientific data, grants, things like that, that they use it on. they see those things very thematically. The usual computer scientist looks at these models and sees when you do a topic model of all the NIH grants given in a year, you see, there's the spinal grant category, and spine and nervous system, all those things come up in one. You have, the ophthalmologic category. You can see thematically. You have, when David Bly does models of Science magazine, you see evolution show up, DNA, genetics. That doesn't happen in the same way when you do topic models of poetry, but you can still get useful information out of it. What you find is that there are semantically evident topics. So yes, you can get a topic that looks like it's all about the sea and water. You can get a topic that is all about God. You can get a topic that is all about family. You can get a topic that is all about love. But those things don't necessarily reflect what the poems are actually about. What we identify is that those are discourses. We use the discourse of courtly love to address several different kinds of themes, topical areas. We use night to address several different kinds of themes. And so it becomes useful, but useful in a different way. And so I started to develop ways of interpreting the models accordingly. And then semantically opaque topics. So in topic modeling, if you have, what happens is the topics come out. Let me see if I can, I'm going to see if I can grab. This is what your topic modeling results look like. Okay. So you got a list. I don't know why it won't zoom in for you anymore. Afterwards, if you want to look at these a little more closely, what you get is a topic ID number. You get the percentage of the corpus that it estimates, draws from that category of words, and then you get a list of keywords. And those are, when we talk about topics, what we talk about is that human beings go in and they look at all of those words and they say, oh, sure, this is a theme about X. Well, if you get one that says cow, God, brutality, it's very hard to sort of piece together what those mean. Now, for a computer scientist, that's very frustrating. For me and for most humanists, that just becomes really a rich area to explore. Why does it put those things together? I'm going to come back here, see if I can fix what I just did here. Okay. Oh, I see why. Sorry. Okay. That's stop words. That's kinds of topics. So what about the actual poems themselves? This one I found was particularly interesting because it demonstrated that you can make a discovery of something new. In topic 12 of a model of all of the poems with 60 topics, 60 possible topics, one of those topics came out to be particularly elegiac. All of the poems in that category most closely associated with that topic were elegies, except for two significant exceptions. And neither of them were ekphrastic. This isn't an ekphrastic discovery. One of them was Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask, and the other one was called The Slave's Complaint. When I first did my first paper on this, I had mislabeled in the metadata that The Slave's Complaint was a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and used this topic as an example of a demonstration that Paul Laurence Dunbar is one of the first poets in the African American literary tradition to use elegy as a discourse in which to engage with ideas of slavehood. when I went back and was revising this essay for a publication, I recognized the mistake, and I noticed that the other poem was by a poet named George Moses Horton. George Moses Horton was the first slave to publish in the United States. He published this poem in 1829, long before Paul Laurence Dunbar. And a little bit of research is starting to show that Horton's poems, as they were published, were in a library that Paul Laurence Dunbar frequently used in Cleveland. So it changes our sense of that history to the extent that we can now look and do a kind of active recovery. That this is a poet that is not frequently considered. We've got some ways into canon reformation. This is a poet who is not frequently considered to be sort of the site of originating that kind of discourse about slavehood in poetry. And we can start to go back and excavate maybe some of the transmission of that use, which also to me demonstrates that there is some value in being able to look at ekphrasis this way, because if I can do that with something I didn't expect, then the likelihood is that I might be able to use this on large collections of poems and start to uncover ekphrastic examples by women along the same lines that we didn't before either consider to be ekphrasis or didn't recognize as part of our usual literary tradition. The other thing that I was able to do, and this is a network graph of all the poems in my corpus, 4,500, and it's a social network graph in which those dots are topics, where you see the big clusters, those are topics, and the outside little dots are individual poems. And so I started to look at the poems graphically as they were associated with topics. And what I found was there was this one topic where all of the poems from one of the anthologies that I entered showed up. And I was like, something went wrong. Like, there's no way. Nothing else does this. None of the other examples do this. I'm doing something wrong. And I went back in and I started pulling it all apart and trying to figure out what I had done if I had gone in and maybe like had the same typo in every single one of those poems or done something wrong. And no, it didn't. So my topic, I think it's topic, that's a different topic, 12. Yeah. Topic 12 had almost every single poem from The Gazer's Spirit, which is an anthology by John Hollander of ekphrastic verse, except all the women, except for one, which was Edith Wharton. So I did a little digging and went back to the texts, and I found that Edith Wharton wrote these two backgrounds. They were divided in the anthology. So he only published the second one, Mona Lisa. He did not publish the first one. These paintings are, what's really exciting to me about this is that you have women in the painting who we expect to be the focal point of an ekphrastic poem, because of course the feminine image, we should be looking at it and ravishing it and all those things according to Mitchell's model. What puts Wharton into that category is her use of language. She uses the discourse of courtly love throughout the entire thing. In neither poem does she mention any of the women. So for an entire poem written about the Mona Lisa, she never once mentions the sitter. The entire poem is about the blue city just over her shoulder. In the other one, the entire poem is about the city just sort of between them, if you can see, kind of in the background. So what she does is she takes the language, the kind of discourse that's frequently used in ekphrasis, and she deploys it on something completely off-center. And she does that so that she doesn't commit any of those kinds of errors or ravishings that one might imagine that a sort of Mitchell's model ekphrasis does. So for me, this is an indication that when I'm looking at these topics of ekphrastic poems, that the interesting elements there are the outliers, are the exceptions, and that those might be the most fruitful places to go in and start rereading how we've used language in ekphrasis and whether or not we're deploying it to create a kind of counter voice or resistance to the model that Mitchell suggests. I also arrived at a few best practices for anybody who wants to try this at home. You want to start with questions that don't require a lot of metadata. So it takes a lot of time to sort through your poems and start saying, you know, I want to check this, check that. Like if you want to enter all the dates or something like that. Start with some questions that you can ask about your data set that don't require a whole lot of extra information about it. Create a method of journal keeping so that you can see sort of your decisions about how you're treating the data all the way through. For me, that was very important because as I kept working with the stop word lists and those kinds of things, I needed to keep a very close record of how I was treating the data and how that affected the outcome of the experiments. The repository for the data, you need a good place to stick it so that it doesn't get messed up. So your computer's not a good place to leave a data set of 4,000 poems that you've worked really hard on. So using something like Git or some other repository source helps you to keep a track of the versions as you've modified your data set and gone along. So what happens next? There are lots of promising things that are happening in the field of topic modeling and data mining that could be very useful to people who are interested in studying poetry this way. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that anytime you do this kind of work, it really does send you right back to reading the poems. And that sense that you could really, in this kind of work, I think that when Ted comes next month and talks about what he's doing, you know, we're asking very different kinds of questions, and so the questions that he's asking are more appropriate to the kinds of ways that he's reading it. The questions that I'm asking tend to turn you right back to those close readings again. There are new kinds of topic models that may help me to refine the way that I'm doing my work. One of them is called a semi-supervised topic model, so that you can actually go into the model and see how it's taking maybe one of those words, like one of those pieces of fruit, and it keeps putting it in the wrong basket. And I can go in and say, no, every time you want to put this word into this basket. So that you can go in and detect misreadings of words or, you know, something like that, so you can have a little bit of control. There's also chronologic and dynamic topic models that can start looking at date data, which I think will be really useful because language changes from the Romantics through the moderns through the contemporaries change sort of how some of those models play out. So I'd like to see models as they show up across time differences. And also hierarchical models, so that what we can see is how a topic changes over time. So each topic model, it doesn't just look at the, when we did our basket experiment, we just did that one time. The computer does it 1,000 times. So it goes back and it recounts, excuse me, and recounts and recounts and recounts over and over and over again. What I think is really interesting, what computer scientists don't think is interesting at all, but to me, I think that this is actually very useful for the kind of work that we do, is to see how the computer changes its assessment of a particular topic and throws words out and brings it back in and throws back word. It's particularly boring work, but I think it could be interesting. Visualizations are hard. You could see from the hairball graph that I put up earlier, being able to make sense out of the visualizations is very challenging. That's going to be something that we have to continue to work on. And one of the problems is, excuse me, finding a good way to trim the data. So we have a mass of data. I'm only beginning to start to figure out how to make determinations about what makes a good topic, what makes a not so good topic, how you read those kinds of topics. what we really need is to be able to throw some of the data out without having to look at it that way, because it's a ton of data. So, for example, if you have 4,500 poems and you associate them across 60 topics, it's 4,500 times 40 for the number of kinds of data elements that you get back. Determining what a salient relationship is, where that cutoff is, and where it's not, isn't something that we've quite figured out yet. You can do that for nonfiction, for scientific texts, for literary theory texts, you can do that. For fiction, you can even do that pretty well. For poetry, I'm not sure that we're ready to quite go there yet. And the thing is that there's a lot to think about in terms of numbers. You know, what is a good data set size? And how do we make those determinations? I personally, in my own text, need to increase the number of ekphrastic poems in the sampling. I need to be able to do more of the big model so I can see how ekphrastic poems differ in their topic assignments from non-ekphrastic poems, but because of the challenge of the data size, so when you put in small data, you get big data back. So any large data thing that you're working with, the little bit of data you get in, you end up producing even more data, and then you have to have ways of sorting through all of that, and that's still a challenge. And that's what I say here, that even a small data topic model produces big data results. And we're still trying to figure out how to represent those. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for your patience. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating what you're doing. I'm curious, though, you started out with Mitchell's model, and I was wondering if you could say something about how your work is actually going to revise that model. Do you find
Sure.
some patterns? What is your data
Sure.
for that model?
So that's kind of how the way that I got into it was reworking that model from a close reading perspective. So I do have, my suggestion is to start reading ekphrastic poems as socially situated networks that extend to contextual situations, other images, and that the very narrow tripartite network is too limiting a way to look at a poem, even though it's simple and seemingly very easy and can be written on just about everything. My argument is that it's not big enough to really account for the variety and the sort of the counter voices and the resistances, and I do that on a very close reading level. And so the challenge for me is being able to make the connection between what I'm seeing here and being able to do that. And one of the ways that I do that is by talking about each of those topics as a part of the contextual network. So every poem is every poem is part of an ongoing discourse. Part of the problem with it's actually really interesting about ekphrasis, is that ekphrasis is always entering belatedly into a conversation. That there's already an artist who has at some point made a comment by creating an artifact, by making an art object. So the poet always comes into that engagement somewhat belatedly, and the reader comes even after that, because it's through the poem that they're exposed to the artwork. Because of that, they end up really being part of a kind of discourse, a much larger discourse. And so any poem, any ekphrastic poem, is going to be drawing from an existing discourse, an existing way in which those words have been used in relationship to that object. And so what I'm looking for here is talking about each one of those poems. So for example, looking at the Edith Wharton poem, and saying that you can't just look at that tripartite speaker, reader, and artwork network without also considering the fact that that same language is being used to very different ends by poets who have already written on art objects, and specifically the ones that Wharton is referring to. So her work models with other poems that are written about the Mona Lisa, but she never refers to the Mona Lisa. And so my point is that you actually need to read each of those poems in conjunction with one another, and that network, that smaller network, has to be seen in relationship to the other poems that take that same object of inquiry. Yeah.
Thank you. Again, I mean, I'm coming at this from very much more from the kind of the humanist side and the digital side of things. But one of the things that is, it's hard to talk about ekphrasis without talking about the way that it's been used to in your title you use the sister arts. I mean, often, discussions about ekphrasis come down to which is superior, the written word.
Yes, it's about the competition, the paragonal competition between.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, I mean, one of the things, I mean, I work with the earlier ekphrasis, I mean,
sure.
Tradition and Greek and Latin poetry. So in those poems, there's much of what seems to be happening is not exactly a description of a work of art, but things that could never happen in a work of art, like things come to life. There's a lot of reference to movement,
yes.
to psychology, and to all the kinds of things that only a poet can tell you about a work of art, which is subjective.
Which fuels the competition between the artists.
Right. So I'm wondering, I guess my question is really, it seems like what you're sort of moving towards is that female authors, which of course we don't have any of in the corpus that I work with, are entering into this discourse in a kind of, they're appropriating certain language, certain ways of looking to kind of make it their own and say this isn't about a male gaze upon a female.
Well, the question is does that competition work if the way that you are establishing your authority over the visual image is in your ability to move and speak, right? That you're active, the active organizing voice is establishing its authority over the silent and still image, right? And if that silence and stillness is characterized as femininity,
right,
then when a woman speaks about that image, she comes to it with a different set of references from her own identity than the way a male poet would. And so for me, thinking about other options for the ekphrastic model, I find women's ekphrasis to be particularly hopeful of a way in which one works around that kind of engagement. And for example, if you look at Wharton's poem, she's deploying a sort of male gaze in which she is in competition with the artwork about bringing that city to life. She gives it a characteristic, she gives it a quality. She actually, treats it as a sort of living being. But she does it because she specifically doesn't refer to the woman in the image. She's making a point about the fact that competition only serves, a certain number of ends, and that she points to the silliness of it.
Right.
So I think that's what is really attractive to me about looking at examples. Am I answering that question at all?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's related to the idea. I mean, it really, ekphrasis is about poetry. It's not really about art.
Well, I mean, to a certain degree it is, and it's because that distinction, especially in the 20th century, becomes very porous.
Right.
If you look at examples, particularly contemporary examples by like Kiki Smith and Mei Brusenberg, who do a little bit of kind of collaborative work. So Kiki will create a painting, and Mei will respond to it in writing. It's done in this conversation back and forth between artists, not as a way of establishing superiority of one over the other, but as a way of finding a sense of community between the two of them. And they have symbiosis, which is, maybe that's Barbara Guest and Kiki Smith. But it's out of a similar impetus. And so it is about the art, to the extent that those artists are also recognizing the graphic significance of language. And so there's a lot of sort of work that moves towards artist books and things like that, that are really trying to engage with the graphical significance of what language is, its own silences and sort of spatial properties.
Right, I mean, in a sense, it's what you're doing in your work. Is
Yeah.
like taking this visual information and turning it into it.
And it's challenging. I mean, one of the things that I think is for me very hard is that it really has removed even the graphical presence of the words in order to do some of this. And I think that this is again, when I go back to those ideas of the limitations of or the conditions of reading, that you have limits of closeness. And I think that one of the things that we learned from that stop word analysis is that closeness can be just as perverting for us when we are so caught up in those small words, and yet we can still see patterns without them that are really significant to the work. And on the opposite end, that distance, what we're removing are a lot of things that we find very important about poetry, about its organization on the page, its visual layout, and also there are lots of ekphrastic poems that, for example, are printed in books alongside the image.
Or in the shape of.
Right.
Like there are these Greek
Right.
about fish, they're in the shape of fish.
And there's another, and one of the things I'm still hoping, haven't really kind of felt confident enough to sort of put it up for people, but I'm trying to look at the recuperative efforts of poems about visual arts. So when you look at poems on artwork that is no longer accessible to an audience, and the poet's sort of sense of responsibility about creating a history for an object that has no history. And there are some other really interesting post-colonial readings of poems that I think, so I look at Elizabeth Alexander's The Venus Hottentot, which is a very contemporary poem. In that, Elizabeth Alexander draws her voices for the Venus Hottentot from some scientific images that were taken of a woman in, 18 something or other, when she was taken from South Africa, brought to London, and then put on display as a human exhibit, and then taken to Paris and treated not the way in which she thought she was going to be treated when she agreed to it. She was, put in absurd clothing. There's all kinds of, and then she was basically treated as a scientific experiment by Georges Cuvier, and then her body, once she passed away, was cut up and autopsied and put in jars and placed in the museum, the Museum, and was there until 1992. And Elizabeth Alexander writes an ekphrastic poem that very clearly recreates a voice of a woman who no longer had a voice and was nothing but physical representation that was outside of her control. And so I see particular opportunities in ekphrasis for doing recuperative work, and I think that there are lots of women who do, about giving voices to people, but there's an anxiety over how do you give someone a voice without becoming its ventriloquist. And so there's what I'm hoping to see is if I can get enough examples that we can start to see some of those ekphrastic poems maybe modeling with poems that are not ekphrastic that do similar kinds of work, and start to talk about how when you look at ekphrastic poems in this big way, and you can see trends where some ekphrastic poems model more with poems that have other kinds of agenda, that we might be able to see some opportunities for poets to work outside of that seeming sort of obvious necessary competition between two rival artists. Yeah. Sorry, I hope that's not a longer answer then.
No,
That's great.
Do you label or characterize your topics in any way, or is it just topic 12 with that list of words, or do you sort of look at that list of words as a whole and think, oh, this is clearly about like natures? I mean,
So-
how do you kind of deal with your topics?
So the usual way, what most people do when they do this is that they look at each topic and they see this string of words. I wish I had, let me see if I can find you a really good example so I can, I think if I do it in the non-editing or the non-display version. There, see how clearer it comes? Isn't that weird? All right. This is actually the 4 models that I was telling you about with the stop words at various levels. So here is, for example, what some of the results are when I leave all of the stop words in. And it's very hard to see any rationale for the clustering of those. Except, you can see a lot about pronouns. And I say, if you wanted to study pronoun usage in poetry, this would be pretty interesting. But that's not what I wanted to do. Oops, wait a minute. Come here. What I found more useful for the kinds of questions I was asking was this one. If I can just get into it. Oh, look, that's not the right topic 12, but here you go. So you can see the kinds of topics that I'm working with. Now, if you were looking at a topic model of All of Science magazine, these would be very obvious to you. You would see things like, DNA, gene, that kind of thing, and it would make a lot of sense. This is what I was talking about in terms of the sort of semantically opaque and semantically evident. You can look at this one and say, oh yeah, mother, father, boy, children, child, son, home, that is a topic about family. And then when I would go in and I would say, so because I didn't trust these things, because I know the figurative language has such a high degree of subtext and ambiguity, I didn't trust that. And so I would go in and I would look at the particular poems and realize that there were kinds of poems that tended to use the language of family to access other thematic concerns. So to me, this is a critical difference between how poetry models in topic models versus how other kinds of texts might model. So, I can look here and I can see, oh, well, that's a topic about the semantically evident. That's poem, words, book, write, word, poems. Right? It seems pretty obvious. A lot of poetry is about poetry. But a lot of poetry about poetry is actually about something else. And so what I find really interesting is that I can then go back into that topic and I can look at all the poems about poems and I can see how we use poems to talk about all kinds of different things. So it's, to me, an excellent and provocative exploratory tool. And I've so far used as that. I would never use this as evidence. So, I would never say, well, this poem is ekphrastic because it's in this topic. That to me seems like it would never be a very useful way or reliable way of going about it. What I see, though, is that if I want to talk about things like tree flowers, flower, summer green, fruit, sweet, and see the ways in which that language has been deployed by different poets, that gives me a very good list of poems that draw very heavily from that kind of usage of language. And that I see as very useful because it puts together some things that are unexpected that I just would not have, like the Dunbar. I mean, those were all, ekphrasis tends to be very elegiac. It treats the static image as something that has died, which is why it produces in the poet so much anxiety about this still thing. And so, what I've discovered is that you go into these things and you see a poem that you didn't expect to be in that group, and that tends to prompt some really interesting readings from which other kinds of questions evolve. So that's what I see really is the direction in which it can go. And for me, it calls to mind like a Jerome McGann sense of deformance. And that to me, this is a very productive form of deformative criticism, where you take the language and you've really pulled it apart in purposeful ways and found patterns that can then give you a new insight into reading that text. And particularly because ekphrasis is so wrought with that sense of competition, it's very hard to read these poems without entering into them with an assumption that this is how it's going to go. And so that, for me, is why this seems so promising, is that when there are these kinds of biases about genre, biases about poets, about particular aspects of close reading, by accessing this, it throws it into a new context and challenges me to really think about my assumptions. And that is what I think is so promising and so useful. I don't see any answers here to anything. And that, I think, is why I like it so much. There's a lot of lip service given to like being able to find, these things that we didn't know existed. And I think that's true, but I don't think it's necessarily because the computer is smarter than we are. I think it's because using the powers of computation, we can create startling contrasts that make us think differently, and in purposeful ways, as opposed to chaotic ways. Alright?
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.